A weekend of riots. Vandalism and violence erupt around the United States following the death of a black man in police custody in Minnesota. We have team coverage, including how President Donald Trump is responding. Seeking transparency. Pope Francis makes a new law regarding the Vatican's financial transactions. We have a report from Rome. And asking for help. The Holy Father participates in a rosary with Marian shrines around the world. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, June 1st, 2020. Good evening and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. Protesting has spread all over the United States. The anger sometimes leading to vandalism and violence. The death of George Floyd has sparked demonstrations in dozens of cities denouncing police brutality. Correspondent Mark Irons starts off our team coverage tonight.
Tension building across the country. Weekend protests took place around the clock.
We stand for the ones who's been knocked down, the ones who can't stand up no more because they don't have a voice anymore.
Anger spreading over the death of George Floyd, who died last week in the custody of Minneapolis police.
Hands up, don't shoot! Hands up, don't shoot!
I'm about to die to see.
We deserve justice, not just for what happened to Mr. Floyd in Minneapolis, but what's happening to black men and women all across this country, and that's been happening.
Thousands of National Guard members activated in 15 states to help with crowd control. Mixed in with peaceful protest,
Go inside now! Get in the house!
violent confrontations, vandalism, and fires. We were here just last night when this building lobby was broken into and set ablaze. And we've seen 3 nights of protest in Washington, D.C., windows boarded up hours after they've been busted, and there's been looting across the country. Even this Catholic bookstore run by Pauline nuns in Chicago was damaged, and St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York sprayed with graffiti. Although agitation between police and protesters is playing out across the U.S., there have been scenes of unity. A moment of solidarity when the NYPD knelt with demonstrators in New York. And on Sunday, the Minneapolis police chief met with protesters at the site where George Floyd's neck was pinned by an officer's knee.
Our community members need to know that the men and women that put this badge on, that they are doing so in service to them, and they should not have to doubt. They should not have to doubt the integrity and if they're going to be treated in a compassionate and professional way.
In Washington, Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
President Donald Trump is monitoring the violence from the White House, and he does not have to look far to see the demonstrators and the rioters. There were hundreds of protesters right across the street in Lafayette Park. Secret Service agents even rushed the president to a bunker in the White House on Friday night. Correspondent Owen Jensen reports now from the White House. Owen?
Tracy, here at the White House earlier this afternoon, Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany held a news conference. I asked her what the president's reaction is to the burning and defacing of St. John's, which is nearby.
White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany addressing the violence and rioting.
The president has made clear that what we are seeing on America's streets is unacceptable. Violence, looting, anarchy, lawlessness are not to be tolerated.
Earlier, her boss, President Donald Trump, tweeted, "Sleepy Joe Biden's people are so radical left that they are working to get the anarchists out of jail, and probably more." And in another tweet, "I don't see any indication that there were any white supremacist groups mixing in. This is an Antifa organization." On Sunday night, chaos erupted just yards away from the White House. Flames and fury, tear gas and flashbangs, pushing and running. Some people took cover around nearby historic St. John's Church, known as the Church of the Presidents. It too was targeted. One area near the church even set on fire, and at one point it was vandalized with graffiti.
After another night of unrest, the gentleman behind me blasting away all the graffiti, and there's plenty of it.
Nearby buildings spray painted up and down, some of it expressions of frustration and pent-up anger, and other words simply too vile to put on TV.
In a particularly egregious act, St. John's Church, Church of the Presidents, was targeted last night. Graffiti all over, set on fire. What is the president's reaction to that, please?
It's hurtful. That doesn't honor the legacy of George Floyd. It doesn't further the cause. And those are violent anarchists, Antifa, who are taking advantage of the pain of people, the pain of the peaceful protesters. It's inexcusable, and we have to stand as one America against the burning of the church and the defacement of the Lincoln Memorial.
Now, the rioting and the protesting have pushed the pandemic off the front page, but here's an update on that. The Florida Keys have reopened for the first time in 2 months after being closed due to the virus. Tracy?
Okay, thank you, Owen. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reporting for us tonight. While the Senate returns to Washington today, reacting to the death of George Floyd, Minority Leader Chuck Schumer says lawmakers must work to end racism, racial disparities, and injustice in America. Correspondent Eric Rosales reports now from Capitol Hill. Eric?
Well, Tracy, here on Capitol Hill, senators are returning to heightened security. Not only is there a barricade around the Capitol, but there's also an increased police presence both inside and outside of the Capitol. Meanwhile, lawmakers are offering solutions for ways to heal this broken country.
Demonstrators gathered yesterday outside the U.S. Capitol protesting the murder of George Floyd, and lawmakers of both parties were swift to react, both to Floyd's death.
The murder of George Floyd is both a tragedy and a travesty.
And to what the violent protests say about our country.
We are not manifesting the conviction as a society to heal ourselves. And right now you're seeing the consequences of that.
Lawmakers pointed to the differences between the protesters and violent activists.
While these protesters that are out there to talk about these issues and to point to Mr. Floyd's murder, these protesters have been largely peaceful. They are not the ones looting and burning and hurting people.
Administration officials say Antifa is to blame for the violent protests. Short for anti-fascist, Antifa is a term for far left-leaning militant groups. U.S. Attorney General William Barr warned, quote, "The violence instigated and carried out by Antifa and other similar groups in connection with the rioting is domestic terrorism and will be treated accordingly." Democratic Senator Cory Booker says his team is currently drafting legislation to change the law that governs police misconduct and to create a national registry for police misconduct.
We are all weaker because we have allowed so much injustice to last so long. And so now it's a time to take this energy and this anger and this focus and keep it until we actually change laws and systems of accountability that can raise standards in our country.
The chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Lindsey Graham, is calling the death of George Floyd, that is, horrific. He's also calling for a hearing to look into police brutality, and he is also hoping for calming nights. Tracy?
Correspondent Eric Rosales reporting from Capitol Hill for us tonight. Thank you, Eric. And joining me now on Skype to talk more about this is Gloria Purvis, host of EWTN's Morning Glory. Gloria, welcome back to the show. Good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you too, Tracy.
Oh, Gloria, you know, the killing of George Floyd has exposed an enormous amount of frustration and pain across our country, especially in the African-American community. Can you talk about what you've been seeing and hearing?
People are very angry. People are very sad. And people are wanting change, and they're frustrated because it's not just George Floyd. We've seen a pattern of this from Tatiana Jefferson, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, even in the Minnesota area a few years ago, Philando Castile. People remember Alton Sterling. So we're seeing a pattern that has just inflamed and hurt and made people frustrated. And we want to be just as much a part of America as anyone else and treated the same under the law with the same protections. And I think seeing the George Floyd murder was so traumatizing and so hurtful and made people feel so helpless that they just are crying out that we've got to do something now. This can no longer happen. And as a Catholic, having seen the video was so painful to me just to see the image of God stamped out, not only in Mr. Floyd, but also in those police officers who stood by and did nothing with their colleague as he knelt on this man's neck for 9 minutes. We have to remember that the image of God in these police officers as well is damaged when they act in ways contrary to their vow to, protect and serve, and really just as decent human beings.
Yeah, and Gloria, in your opinion, what do you think it's going to take for us to realize some progress here?
I think we're going to have to change some policing policies at the state and local level. We need to have more strict policies about police use of force. We need to look at what some people would say is the demilitarization of police forces. Do they need the kind of weapons that they have? They're not going to war. They're just trying to protect our citizenry. And also we should look at things like establishing non-911 police calls for people experiencing mental health issues. And we also should look at the Department of Justice getting more involved in being able to investigate police departments, as well as looking at police union contracts. Are they purging records of misconduct? Are they rehiring officers who've been fired for, these kinds of violations in other police departments? There are a number of things that we're going to need to do. And this is the beginning of the hard look and having a lot of community support in getting these things done. If we have the will to do it, we can change this.
In a way, George Floyd's killing has brought some unity in a sense that many people of all races and backgrounds here in the U.S. and around the world have come to get together, that is, to condemn it. That said, how do you think we can build on that, Gloria? And is there a way to lower tensions?
I think there's a way to lower tensions. I think if we have dialogue, I remember if we could also share the images of the positive things happening, seeing the people cleaning up together, multiracial groups of people cleaning up together in these cities that have had this kind of destruction, if you will, and also showing the images of police officers kneeling with protesters. There's a beautiful image out of Coral Gables, Florida, of the police kneeling as the protesters came up, and they also knelt as well. They also a beautiful image of two groups of people kneeling to each other and begging for forgiveness and asking the Lord to come and heal these wounds. I mean, there are good things out there, and we should be sharing that because we have to help people realize there is hope and we can change, and there are people that are doing good, and we can be a part of that.
Absolutely. Well, Gloria, thank you so much for your time, my friend. God bless you. Gloria Purvis, host of EWTN's Morning Glory.
Thank you, Tracy.
Coming up, an update on the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong and analysis of a new Vatican law aimed at increasing transparency in financial dealings. Russian President Vladimir Putin is setting the date for a vote on constitutional amendments that could allow him to extend his rule. The vote was postponed because of the coronavirus pandemic. Putin says Russians will now go to the polls July 2nd to approve the changes to the Russian constitution. The amendments would allow Putin to stay in power until 2036. The United Nations and Saudi Arabia are making an urgent appeal for donations to help Yemen as they are forced to stop some humanitarian aid operations.
Of the 41 major United Nations programs in Yemen, 31 of them are either shutting or reducing.
The U.S. and Saudi Arabia have supported the government of Yemen, which has been fighting the Houthi rebels since 2014. The rebels are preventing aid, and tomorrow a pledging conference is scheduled aiming to raise over $2 billion for Yemen. Police in Hong Kong have rejected an application for an annual candlelight vigil marking this week's anniversary of the 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown. This would mark the first time in 30 years that it will not be held. The news follows last week's approval of a new national security law for Hong Kong. Many in Hong Kong are rushing to apply for passports, promising them overseas British nationality, days after Britain said it is exploring options that may allow them to eventually seek citizenship. Joining me now on Skype from Hong Kong is Wilson Lung, a lawyer and pro-democracy activist. Wilson, welcome back to the show. So good to see you. First off, I want to get your reaction to today's announcement banning the annual candlelight vigil marking the anniversary of Tiananmen Square.
Well, I think it's a terrible announcement. I mean, this event is one of the trademark events in the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement. Hundreds of thousands of people every year celebrate remember the Tiananmen tragedy. But this is the first year since the Chinese handover that it's been banned. And unfortunately, what's even worse is with the new national security law being imposed by Beijing, it may very well be the last we ever see of this vigil.
I know police are saying they're banning this because it would violate social distancing rules. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it seems we've seen a pattern of these social distancing rules being selectively enforced against pro-democracy protesters, whereas they take a more lenient attitude towards the pro-Beijing protests and also towards entertainment districts. Also, actually, the COVID-19 problem in Hong Kong, we're having single-digit infections, very low rates, and it's not difficult to suspect that the regulations are being used and put in place to suppress the pro-democracy protests.
Wilson, you mentioned the new national security law briefly. Can you talk a little bit more about that and explain that to us?
What's happening is that Beijing has decided to draft a new so-called national security law for Hong Kong and impose it on Hong Kong. And these are going to criminalize vague concepts such as subversion, sedition, foreign interference, and also terrorism. Now, these concepts are all well and fine, but the problem is who's drafting them and what will they contain. And we've seen that in China itself, these very laws are used to suppress activists and to suppress human rights. So, for example, subversion was the charge used against Nobel Prize Peace Laureate Liu Xiaobo.
And I know that you've been following these pro-democracy efforts in Hong Kong. What's the impact this is already having on the pro-democracy movement and the protests that we've seen?
It's a devastating impact. Already the pro-democracy groups in Hong Kong are self-censoring themselves in anticipation of the law, which may or may not be retrospective. So we've seen them, for example, afraid to link up with international human rights organizations, afraid to speak to international media, and also being restricted in what they say publicly. Many people have shut their Facebook pages or are changing to anonymous names so as not to fall foul of the new law.
Wilson, we don't have much time left, but I really want to ask you this last question, if we can get it in. We've seen the video of people preparing to leave Hong Kong. Tell us, what is the mood like there?
I think there's certainly a lot of people thinking that this is the end of Hong Kong as a semi-free city, and it's time to leave. We've seen searches for immigration agencies increase 20-fold. And, there's a lot of discussion of assets and people being moved out of Hong Kong.
Wilson, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate your perspective.
Thank you.
Well, the state of emergency in Japan is now over, and stores, gyms, and even movie theaters are reopening. In the capital of Tokyo, tourist spots have a few visitors, and at Gold's Gym, customers get their temperature taken, and plexiglass keeps everyone separated, and people at movie theaters must maintain social distancing. Bangladesh reopens to heavy traffic jams. Buses, trains, and flights resume today as Bangladesh gradually eases restrictions due to the coronavirus pandemic. Public transportation had been suspended for 3 months. Catholics in Portugal can finally attend public masses once again. Parishioners at the historic Estrela Basilica in Lisbon also have to sit apart. Everyone is wearing masks and hand sanitizer is available. Under the new rules in Portugal, only a limited number of people can attend, depending on the size of the church. The Vatican issues a new law to help fight corruption in its financial transactions. The regulation gives new procedures for awarding public contracts. It also ensures Holy See officials will work only with approved financial partners. The measure brings the Vatican in line with international anti-corruption laws. Edward Pentin, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, joins us now. Ed, good to see you.
Good to see you, Tracy.
So, Ed, why did the Vatican create this law, and what exactly does it do?
Well, it's really to deal with the reports that we've heard over the years of corruption in the Vatican, and it's really aimed at streamlining the workings of the Vatican, particularly regarding external contracts and external contractors. And what it does is it implements more transparency, control, and really better efficiency regarding these external contracts to avoid corruption in those areas. It brings them up to international standards, and it also puts restrictions on nepotism, which has been a constant problem in the Vatican for many years. And it also puts restrictions on hiring dubious contractors and those perhaps involved in crime or money laundering, and it puts safeguards on that as well.
Why is it coming out now?
Well, it's the fruit of 4 years' work between dicasteries, and some people have said, why has it taken so long? Well, I think part of the reason is because there's been resistance to it from certain people in the Vatican who sort of part of these corrupt practices. But it has been a lot of consultation between different Vatican bodies. But the goal is to achieve, as they say, cost savings, effectiveness, and efficiency. And that, of course, is very important at the moment because of the financial constraints put on the Vatican during this time of the pandemic. So they're very keen that this comes out now as well for that reason.
Ed, what's been the reaction so far?
Well, very favorable. I mean, this has been expected and wanted for a long time. And sources that I've spoken to close to the Secretariat for the Economy say the measures represent a wonderful advance. And in fact, it's something that the Secretariat, since its inception in 2014, has been pushing for. And I think Cardinal Pell, who was the previous prefect of the Secretariat, was also very keen on this as well. It won't be a panacea for the corruption in the Vatican, or at least this malpractice. There will be personnel who will remain there, but at the same time, they do spell out these laws a new methodology, which has to be followed, of course, if they're to guarantee transparency, control, and competition in external contracting.
I know Pope Francis has repeatedly promised internal reforms at the Vatican. Do you think this is a step in that direction?
Yes, I think many people are seeing it that way, and it does seem to be part of the process of reform, especially financial reform. And this is something that was part of his mandate when he was elected 7 years ago. Some say, why is it taking so long? As I said before, I think it has been because of the resistance, but there do seem to be people in position now, in positions of leadership in the Vatican, particularly in the Secretariat for the Economy, who are keen to push these reforms forward now and really try to tackle this corruption head on.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ed, for your time and for your analysis on this. Edward Pentin, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Thanks again, Ed.
Thank you, Tracy.
Up next, state officials issue a ruling on whether Missouri's final abortion clinic can remain open. And Pope Francis reminds the faithful of the power of God's love for us. The only abortion clinic in Missouri gets to keep its license and will continue operating. The Missouri Health Department refused to renew the license of Planned Parenthood after it found 4 failed abortion attempts last year. But now a Missouri administrator has decided the health department was wrong. Missouri's Attorney General is reviewing the ruling. The United Nations Human Rights Council has accused some U.S. states of manipulating the coronavirus pandemic to restrict abortions. The UN takes issue with some states classifying elective abortions as non-essential medical procedures. And you can read more about how a U.S. official is responding by going to our sister publication, CatholicNewsAgency.com. It was a busy weekend for Pope Francis. Yesterday, he celebrated Mass in St. Peter's Basilica and urged the faithful to be builders of unity.
Guardiamo la Chiesa come fa lo Spirito.
On the solemnity of Pentecost, the Holy Father said Christians should seek to give of themselves to others, and it is the Holy Spirit who will help us overcome our selfish and greedy attitudes. Health regulations allowed for only a limited attendance at Mass. The Holy Father also reminded the faithful why we should never be afraid.
Riconciliata e pronta alla missione.
At his Sunday address to pilgrims at the Vatican, the Holy Father says constant strength and help come from loving God and trusting in his mercy and goodness. One way to find that love is by seeking help from the Holy Spirit. Yesterday marked the first time in nearly 3 months crowds were allowed in St. Peter's Square for the address. And on Saturday, Pope Francis prayed the rosary at the Lourdes Grotto in the Vatican Gardens. About 130 people joined the Holy Father. Those most affected by the coronavirus pandemic led the mysteries of the rosary, such as a doctor, nurse, and a hospital chaplain. 50 Marian shrines around the world virtually participated, and thousands of faithful watched and prayed online. And before we go tonight, a reminder, EWTN broadcasts Mass throughout the day. Mass airs at 8 a.m., noon, and 7 p.m. Eastern. We're also airing other special programming, and you can find our schedule at EWTN.com. There you will also find Eucharistic adoration throughout the day. We thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. We're back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.